Mark thought he was celebrating 10 years of love. Emily thought her secret was safe, and Brian thought bragging would make him look powerful, until one careless night at a backyard barbecue exposed everything in front of the entire neighborhood. Mark always believed he had built the kind of life most people only dreamed of. His two-story home in a peaceful suburban neighborhood was something he worked hard for. Every brick, every blade of grass in the front yard was a reminder of his years of dedication. To anyone who passed by, the scene looked perfect. A neat lawn, a warm porch light at night, and a couple who seemed inseparable. Mark and his wife, Emily, were often seen together, whether it was shopping for groceries, taking evening walks, or attending neighborhood gatherings. They gave off the impression of being a solid team, the kind that neighbors admired quietly, sometimes even with envy. In truth, Mark adored Emily. They had met young, and he always saw her as his anchor, someone who gave his life balance when work or the world outside became overwhelming. He remembered their wedding day vividly, the way she looked walking down the aisle, and the promises they made in front of everyone they loved. A decade later, those memories still burned bright in his mind, pushing him to try harder whenever the daily grind of life tested his patience. He considered their 10th wedding anniversary not just a milestone but a testament to everything they had overcome together. That was why he wanted to make the celebration special. A backyard barbecue seemed perfect, casual yet meaningful. A chance to gather friends, family, and neighbors under one roof. Mark spent days preparing, making sure everything would be just right. He mowed the lawn twice, set up the tables with spotless white covers, and bought Emily's favorite flowers to decorate the patio. He wanted her to smile, to feel cherished in front of everyone. The grill was polished until it shined, and the menu was carefully planned with Emily's input. To Mark, it wasn't just a party, it was proof of his devotion. As the invitations went out, the excitement built. Friends promised to bring drinks, relatives offered desserts, and neighbors eagerly talked about the gathering. The barbecue wasn't just for them, it was for the community, a moment for everyone to connect. Mark took pride in hosting, but deep down, his main focus was Emily. He wanted her to look around that night and see the life they had built together, to feel proud of being his wife. He imagined her laughing with their guests, holding his hand and sharing knowing glances that reminded them of the bond they still shared after all these years. The morning of the event, Mark woke earlier than usual. He checked the weather forecast 3 times. Relieved that it promised a warm evening with clear skies, he marinated the meat, set up extra chairs, and even tested the string lights he had hung across the backyard to ensure they created the right glow once the sun went down. Every detail mattered. He looked at Emily, who was getting ready inside, and felt a surge of gratitude. To him, she was still the woman he had fallen for years ago, and he believed the party would be one more chapter in their story of love. But beneath the perfection of the house, the plans and his optimism, something darker was waiting. Something he could never have prepared for. At that moment, however, Mark had no idea. All he saw was the dream he thought was real. Brian had lived next door to Mark and Emily for just over 2 years. He was the kind of neighbor who never quite blended in with the rest of the quiet suburban community. While most people in the area kept their yards tidy and their voices low, Brian often played loud music, hosted late-night hangouts, and carried himself with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. He was in his mid-30s, unmarried, and often joked about how he preferred living free without the chains of commitment. Some found his carefree attitude entertaining, but others quietly avoided him, sensing that he enjoyed stirring trouble wherever he went. For Mark, Brian had always been more of an acquaintance than a friend. They exchanged polite greetings, occasionally helped each other with small tasks, but never formed a close bond. Still, it seemed natural to invite him to the anniversary barbecue. It wasn't just about politeness. Mark thought including the neighbor would show good spirit and keep the atmosphere light. Emily had mentioned once or twice that Brian was funny, someone who could make people laugh even in dull moments. That didn't mean much to Mark at the time. He assumed she just meant Brian was entertaining, nothing more. When the evening of the barbecue arrived, Brian was among the first guests to show up. He carried a six-pack of imported beer, slapping Mark on the back as if they had been longtime friends. His energy filled the space immediately, drawing attention with loud jokes and exaggerated stories. He complimented Emily on the decorations, then lingered near her as she arranged dishes on the table. At first it seemed harmless, the kind of banter guests often brought to parties, but Mark noticed something in the way Brian's eyes lingered just a little too long, as though he wasn't only admiring the decor. As more guests arrived, the backyard filled with chatter, laughter and the scent of food sizzling on the grill. Mark kept himself busy, flipping burgers and serving drinks, yet he couldn't ignore the way Brian inserted himself into nearly every conversation. Emily was part of. He leaned close when speaking to her, making jokes that caused her to laugh more freely than usual. She seemed flattered by the attention, brushing her hair back with a shy smile. Mark told himself he was overthinking it, that she was just being polite, but the sight stirred something uneasy inside him. As the night wore on and the drinks flowed, Brian's behavior became more noticeable. He bragged about his car, his workout routine, even hinted at flings with women from other neighborhoods. His confidence didn't waver, even when some guests rolled their eyes at his stories. People laughed along, perhaps out of discomfort or simply because they didn't know how else to respond. Brian fed on the attention, his voice growing louder with every drink. Mark tried to brush it off, focusing on his role as host, but the sight of Emily laughing at Brian's remarks stuck with him. He couldn't shake the feeling that Brian was performing not for the group, but for her. Every gesture, every exaggerated tale seemed aimed in her direction. The man's arrogance wasn't just about himself, it was about claiming space, testing limits, and seeing how far he could push. What Mark didn't know was that Brian's confidence wasn't baseless. There was something behind his smirk, something hidden in the way he looked at Emily when he thought no one else was watching. It was the kind of confidence that came not from assumption, but from knowledge, and as the evening continued, that secret began to press against the surface, threatening to spill out in the most unexpected way. As the night carried on, the atmosphere shifted from cheerful to something slightly tense, though most guests were too busy enjoying themselves to notice. The grill crackled, music played softly from a speaker in the corner, and glasses clinked as people toasted to Mark and Emily's anniversary. On the surface, everything looked perfect, but beneath the laughter there was an undercurrent of unease. Mark had been keeping a close eye on Brian, who was now several beers deep and talking louder than anyone else in the backyard. The moment began innocently enough. A small group gathered around Brian, near the patio table, drawn in by his bold personality. He leaned back in his chair, waving his bottle around as he spoke, almost as if he were putting on a performance. His stories grew increasingly personal, edging into territory that made some of the listeners shift uncomfortably. He spoke about women he had been with, exaggerating his charm, boasting about nights filled with secret encounters. It was the kind of talk one might expect at a bar, not at a family-oriented barbecue surrounded by children and couples. Mark noticed the glances exchanged between guests. Some smiled awkwardly, others looked away, but no one called him out. Brian thrived on the attention, and the more uncomfortable people became, the more energized he seemed. His words turned sharper, laced with arrogance. He described one particular woman, a married woman. He emphasized with a smug grin, as though she had been a prize he had taken without effort. At first Mark didn't think much of it. People like Brian often stretched the truth for the sake of shock value. But then he added details, little pieces that didn't seem random. The description of her perfume, the way she styled her hair, and a tiny scar on her wrist. Details Brian tossed out carelessly, as though they were just part of his story. Mark froze where he stood by the grill, the spatula in his hand trembling slightly. His mind raced as he replayed Brian's words, matching them against what he knew of Emily. Each clue fit too perfectly, like puzzle pieces sliding into place. Mark tried to convince himself it was a coincidence, that Brian was simply making up a character, but the unease in his stomach told him otherwise. Emily's face didn't help ease his doubts. When Mark turned to look at her, she avoided his gaze, busying herself with serving drinks and chatting with other guests. Yet her smile seemed strained, her laughter a touch too forced. It was as if she too had heard the slip and was silently praying no one else had connected the dots. But Mark had. Every word Brian spoke tightened a knot inside his chest. The group around Brian laughed uneasily at his drunken boasting, brushing it off as crude humor. But Mark couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just talk. Brian wasn't spinning stories for the sake of entertainment. He was hinting at something real, and his pride was slipping through. It was the kind of pride that didn't care about consequences. For the rest of the evening Mark couldn't focus. The sizzling of the grill, the chatter of his guests, even the soft glow of the string lights blurred together as his thoughts spiraled. His marriage, the party, the carefully built image of happiness, it all suddenly felt fragile, as if one more word from Brian could shatter it completely. And deep down, Mark knew the damage had already begun. Mark forced himself to stay calm, though inside his chest a storm was raging. He kept moving from one group of guests to another, smiling when spoken to, nodding at conversations, but his mind was trapped on Brian's careless brag. Every time Emily passed by, carrying a tray or refilling glasses, Mark studied her face, searching for answers in her expressions. She looked radiant, dressed in a simple summer dress that swayed gently as she walked. But to Mark, the glow he once admired now felt like a mask, hiding something darker. He had loved that smile for years, but at that moment, he questioned if it had been genuine all along, or shared with another man behind his back. Brian, meanwhile, didn't seem to notice the shift in the air. He continued his drunken routine, laughing loudly, leaning too close to people, and tossing out reckless remarks. Guests grew more uneasy, some excusing themselves from his circle of stories. A few of the older enders whispered disapprovingly, shaking their heads at his behavior, yet he carried on as if he were untouchable, basking in the spotlight he had created. Mark noticed how often Brian's gaze flicked toward Emily, sometimes with a smirk that lasted only a second but was impossible to miss. It was no longer subtle. It was almost as if Brian wanted him to see it. Mark's hands tightened on the serving tongs until his knuckles turned white. He tried to remind himself of the bigger picture, the anniversary, the guests, the reputation he and Emily had worked so hard to build. Losing his temper in front of everyone would only create chaos. Still, each time he replayed Brian's description, the perfume, the scar, the little details no stranger should know, he felt something breaking inside him. He wanted to demand the truth right there, to strip away the false smiles and expose what had been done to him. But instead, he swallowed his anger and waited, watching the night unravel. As Emily walked past, carrying a plate toward the patio, their eyes met briefly. Mark held her gaze, trying to pierce through her calm expression. For a second, she faltered. Her smile wavered just enough for him to notice. That tiny slip was confirmation, louder than any confession. She knew he had heard. She knew he was connecting the dots. And in that silent moment, their perfect image of a marriage began to crumble. The laughter of guests filled the backyard. But for Mark, the sounds grew distant, muffled by the weight of betrayal pressing down on him. He forced a smile when neighbors approached, complimenting the food or congratulating him on the milestone. Inside, however, he felt like an actor trapped in a role he no longer believed in. Every cheer and every handshake felt like an insult, as though the entire world was celebrating a lie. By the time the string lights flickered on and dusk settled, Mark's chest felt heavy. He realized that what had once been the happiest day of his year had turned into the night his heart shattered, and the worst part was that no one else even noticed. They all still believed in the illusion he had worked so hard to protect. Mark felt like he was living outside his own body. The cheerful noise of the barbecue carried on around him, yet he no longer felt like the host of the gathering. Instead, he had become an observer, silently watching a play where every glance and every gesture carried hidden meaning. He noticed things he would have brushed off before. The way Emily's eyes flicked toward Brian when she thought no one was looking. the small curve of her lips when he made a comment no one else could hear, the quiet, almost invisible pauses in her movements when she sensed his presence nearby. These weren't coincidences, they were signals, subtle threads tying them together right in front of him. Brian, emboldened by alcohol and perhaps by his own arrogance, didn't hide as much as he thought. When Emily stood near the drinks table, he moved toward her under the pretense of pouring another glass. When she carried a platter to the patio, he followed a few moments later, pretending to admire the decorations, but really keeping her within arm's reach. Mark saw it all, the way their paths aligned too easily, how their proximity carried a comfort that strangers or casual friends would never share. Every detail struck Mark like a blow. He had worked tirelessly to prepare this night, making sure everything was perfect for Emily. Yet as he watched from the corner of the yard, he realized he was the only one playing his role honestly. Everyone else seemed caught in unspoken truths and unguarded behaviors. Emily's smile, which he had once believed belonged only to him, seemed shared now. And Brian's smug demeanor, which others dismissed as drunken bravado, carried the weight of a man who knew more than he should. Mark's eyes darted around the guests, wondering if anyone else saw it. The older couples were too busy reminiscing, the younger families focused on their children, and his relatives too wrapped up in casual chatter. To them, it was just another celebration. No one noticed the tension weaving itself into the background, tightening like a noose around Mark's neck. That realization isolated him further. He was trapped in plain sight, surrounded by people, yet completely alone with the knowledge he carried. As the evening darkened and lanterns flickered on, Mark's vigilance deepened. He no longer tasted the food he served, or remembered the jokes people shared with him. All he could focus on was the silent play between Emily and Brian. Mark stood by the grill, pretending to adjust the flames, though his attention never left them. Every second felt heavier than the last, each small movement confirming what he already feared. The barbecue, meant to be a celebration of loyalty and love, had transformed into an unmasking. In the warm glow of the lights and the laughter of neighbors, Mark saw the truth more clearly than ever. What had once been hidden was now being revealed, and there was no turning back from what his eyes had witnessed. By the time the night edged closer to its end, the tension inside Mark had reached a breaking point. He no longer felt like the proud husband hosting an anniversary celebration. Instead, he felt like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, clinging to what little strength he had left. The laughter of his guests felt hollow, each cheer a painful reminder of the lie that had unfolded right before him. Emily still moved gracefully through the crowd, smiling, pouring drinks, chatting with relatives, but every time their eyes met, Mark saw it, the flicker of guilt, the silent admission she could no longer hide. Brian, on the other hand, had grown bolder with each drink. His swagger was more pronounced, his voice louder, his smirk wider. He staggered slightly as he walked toward the fire pit, a beer bottle dangling loosely in his hand. When he spoke, his words slurred, yet his meaning cut sharper than ever. Mark stood only a few steps away, and in that moment Brian muttered something under his breath, just loud enough for him to hear. It wasn't an accident, it was deliberate, a challenge, a cruel reminder of what he had stolen. The words sank deep, heavier than any blow. Mark's pulse raced, his fists clenched so tight his nails bit into his palms. He wanted to shout, to lash out, to expose both Brian and Emily in front of everyone. He wanted to tear down the mask they wore, to make them feel the humiliation he was drowning in. Yet he didn't move. He didn't speak. His anger burned silently, restrained by the presence of friends, neighbors, and family. If he exploded now, the night would descend into chaos, and though part of him wanted that, another part forced him to hold back. Instead, Mark turned his gaze toward Emily. She stood across the yard, her laughter ringing out at something a guest had said. But when she glanced his way, she froze. His stare was steady, unblinking, and filled with all the questions he hadn't yet spoken aloud. In that instant, she knew. She didn't need him to say a word. The truth hung between them, heavy and undeniable. Her smile faltered, her body stiffened, and she quickly turned away, pretending to busy herself with clearing plates. It was too late, though. Mark had seen her reaction, and it confirmed everything Brian's drunken brag had suggested. The silence inside Mark was more terrifying than any outburst could have been. He no longer felt like shouting. Instead, he felt hollow, as though something essential had been ripped out of him. Around him, the party carried on, but he was trapped in a different reality, one where his marriage, his trust, and the life he thought he had built were crumbling piece by piece. He stayed rooted to the spot, his eyes following Emily as she moved through the crowd, every step she took pulling her further away from the woman he thought he knew. The night wasn't over, but something inside Mark already was. Without a single word spoken aloud, the confrontation had taken place. His stare had said it all. She knew that he knew, and there was no undoing it. What had once been hidden in whispers and stolen moments was now exposed in silence, raw and undeniable. When the last guests began leaving, the cheerful noise that had filled the backyard slowly faded, replaced by an uneasy silence that clung to the air like smoke. Mark walked them to the gate, thanking each one mechanically, his voice steady though his mind was anything but. Smiles were exchanged, hands were shaken, but none of it reached him. Behind his polite mask, he was drowning in thoughts he couldn't escape. The glow of lanterns in the yard, once meant to create warmth and celebration, now seemed harsh, exposing the cracks in the life he had once been so proud of. Inside the house, the atmosphere shifted even further. The sound of the door closing behind the final guest echoed through the living room, heavy and final, as though it signaled the end of something far larger than a party. Emily moved quickly to gather plates and half-empty glasses, avoiding his eyes. Her steps were sharp and nervous, unlike the graceful movements she had displayed earlier when laughter and chatter surrounded her. Mark didn't move to help, he simply watched, his silence pressing down on her more than any words could. Minutes passed before she finally set a tray down and turned toward him. For a moment, neither spoke. The house felt too quiet. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen louder than it should have been. Mark stood in the middle of the room, shoulders heavy, his expression unreadable. Emily shifted uncomfortably under his stare, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her dress. It was she who broke the silence first, though her words were halting, fragile and trembling. She admitted what he already knew. The affair hadn't been planned, she claimed, but it had happened, and once it started, it became something she couldn't control. Every sentence pierced Mark, yet none of it surprised him. He had already seen the truth play out in gestures, in glances, and finally in Brian's drunken slip. What hurt most wasn't the act itself, but the way he had found out. Their anniversary, a night meant to celebrate their love, had become the stage for its unraveling. The shame of being humiliated in front of neighbors and friends burned deeper than he expected. It wasn't just betrayal, it was exposure, a cruel spectacle he hadn't asked for. Emily wept, insisting it had been a mistake, a weakness she regretted. She spoke of guilt, of moments she had wanted to confess but couldn't. Her words filled the space, desperate and pleading, but Mark barely heard them. He stood rigid, staring past her, his mind replaying every moment from the night, the smirks, the laughter, the careless pride in Brian's voice. The more Emily spoke, the less her excuses mattered. The damage was already done, and no apology could undo the humiliation carved into him. When her voice finally broke into silence, Mark turned away. His chest was tight, his throat heavy, but he said nothing. His silence spoke louder than her tears. The house, once filled with music and chatter only hours ago, now held only the weight of betrayal and the suffocating truth that nothing would ever return to the way it had been. The days that followed were nothing like the life Mark once knew. The house that had been his sanctuary now felt like a hollow shell, each room echoing with the memories of betrayal. The dining table where they once shared quiet meals sat untouched. The bedroom, once filled with warmth, now felt cold and uninviting. Emily moved through the house like a shadow, quiet and distant, packing small bags of her belongings when she thought Mark wasn't watching. She avoided long conversations, but the silence between them was heavier than any argument could have been. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood, faster than either of them expected. Whispers carried across fences exchanged in hushed tones during morning walks or while collecting mail. The same neighbors who had raised glasses to celebrate their anniversary now looked at Mark with pity and Emily with judgment. Every glance reminded Mark of the humiliation he had suffered, not only from the betrayal itself but from the public way it had come to light. What should have been his private heartbreak had become the community's latest scandal. Emily left the house only a few days later. There were no dramatic goodbyes, no promises of reconciliation. She packed her clothes, avoided Mark's eyes and walked out the front door with her head lowered. The sound of the door closing behind her felt final, like the last nail in the coffin of the life they had built together. Mark stood by the window, watching her car pull away, the taillights fading into the night until nothing remained but the silence of the empty driveway. Brian disappeared for a while after the barbecue. Some neighbors said they saw him leave town. Others claimed he stayed indoors to avoid the backlash. But it didn't matter. His smug grin and careless words had already done their damage. He had vanished from the streets, but the destruction he left behind remained etched into Mark's life. Every time Mark stepped into his backyard, the same spot where Brian had bragged and where Emily had smiled in secret, he felt a twist of anger mixed with sorrow. The space once meant for family gatherings now felt like a crime scene. Mark's days blurred together. Work became a distraction, but even there, he couldn't escape the weight pressing down on him. Nights were worse, filled with sleepless hours and questions he would never have answered. He replayed the evening again and again, searching for signs he might have missed earlier, wondering how long the betrayal had stretched on and how many lies had been spoken under the roof he had built for them. In the end, the cruelest part wasn't just the affair itself. It was the way it had been revealed. A night meant to honor 10 years of love and loyalty had turned into his undoing. The betrayal had been dragged into the light, paraded in front of neighbors and friends, leaving him stripped of dignity. Alone in the quiet house, Mark realized the life he once cherished had ended not with a private confession, but with public humiliation, the kind that could never be forgotten or forgiven.